Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm also a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I are back at it this week. We have a really great chat about what's going on in markets and geopolitics around the world, with thoughts about NATO, hot dogs in Brazil, inflation, and everything else you could imagine. Before we get to that, though, listeners, you know that there are no ads on this podcast, and I'm determined to keep it that way, but I'm going to steal 30 seconds of your time right now to just give you an ad for Cognitive Investments ourselves. We're obviously a wealth management and registered investment advisor, so if you want us to run investments, that is something we do, and you can get in touch. But we've also recently, based on popular demand, made access to our internal research platform available to subscribers. There's also options if you're interested for consulting and advisory services on top of that, which include monthly and quarterly calls with me. But if you are interested in the research platform subscription, or if you want to trial it out, we are offering podcast listeners a 30% discount on the first month to try it out. Just go to the website cognitive.investments and use the promo code POD30 and you will get the discount. If that's too much for you, you can also just email me at jacob@cognitive.investments about this or anything else. That's it. That's the plug. If you're interested in our internal research, there's a promo code for 30% discount. You can find it on the website under the research page or emailing me directly. Okay, enough. Nothing else to do. Let's get into the podcast. Cheers and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, good morning, everyone. We're back at it. Rob, how is it seems that France has not fallen to the Les Mis protests and everything is fine. Is that correct?
Believe it or not, life is pretty normal and people are going about their day eating bread and looking fashionable. So life goes on.
Baguettes and espresso at the barricade later. I look forward to meeting you there. It sounds great. Did you see? I was actually watching. I said this to the listeners. I think in our last episode, I rotate through different news TV channels from different countries every morning, and I had Singapore on yesterday. And I don't know why they were focused on this, but apparently the French are trying to make it so you can bathe in the Seine River again by 2025. Have you heard this?
No, I haven't heard this.
They're trying to clean it up, and they say they're on track to bathing in the river. I think I'm repeating myself. I think I said this in a recent podcast, but I'm still enchanted by the idea of bathing in the river. But you can actually do it because you're literally right there.
Well, I think that's really cool. And it shows, people aren't paying too much attention to this, but some of the things they're doing ahead of the Olympics next year and just with the city itself are pretty extraordinary. As far as, things like bathing in the Seine, we've been focused from a technology standpoint. France is rolling out the first network of eVTOL air taxis. Electric drone taxis. And they claim that they're going to have 5 working hubs in time for the Olympics, which if you look at what other countries are doing from a licensing and approval standpoint, like the US just approved the first prototype test of the first eVTOL, and France is saying they're going to have working commercial networks going in less than 18 months, which is pretty crazy. So I don't know how we got from bathing in the Seine to that, but my point is they're doing good stuff here.
Those are the types of atypical neural connections the listeners want from this podcast, Rob. So let's dive straight into it. We're going to spend just a couple of minutes on the CPI print. CPI was up 0.2%. and rose 3% over the last 12 months. I always like to look at it broken down by category. So up 3% over the last 12 months. Food is still up 5.7% over the last 12 months. Energy is down 16.7%. And then all items less food and energy up 4.8%. I have just one or two thoughts on this, but Rob, I'll let you take the first swing at your reaction just to the print, because the markets are declaring, oh, inflation is over, everything is fine, the Fed is not going to raise anymore after they raise in July. Like that narrative has really taken hold. And we've been saying we think inflation is going to be stickier and that the Fed is probably going to raise rates more than consensus. So I do think we need to confront this a little bit and talk about it for a few minutes. But I imagine we will both have short, pithy takes. But I'll let you go first.
Well, my short, pithy take is this is a great example of how especially when it's a quiet news cycle, which it is for markets. So earnings doesn't start until next week. It's the summer. There's not much happening. Everyone is obsessed with this CPI print. It's, you go through different eras within different market environments where people really focus on one data point and the media picks up on it and everyone, becomes obsessed about it and everyone anticipates it. And oh my God, the print came out. And in the 80s, it was M2 money supply, which today no one, you couldn't even say what that is because no one follows it at all. And in the 2010s, it was the payrolls number, which was the be all end all of the world. And now it's the CPI number, right? So I guess in short, it's one data point and it's something that's being sort of magnified so much because there's not much else going on. Fundamentally, I think what I would say is I don't think it really changes what we're focused on or our thesis because CPI and employment, these are backward-looking indicators. Bankruptcy data, that's another one that people have been focused on, that we've been focused on as well, trying to understand. Really, I think what it behooves one to understand is where are we going to be 9 months from now? Where are we going to be 3 or 4 quarters from now from a macro standpoint? And when you look at the key indicators, it's not necessarily CPI, because that's showing what's already happened. The key indicator to watch is what are these early cyclical indicators showing? What's going to happen with construction? What's happening with the residential building cycle? What's happening with the commercial building cycle? What's happening with data center capacity expansion and corporate investment? And I don't know for sure where those things are going, but you sure as hell want to be focused on those things because those are going to tell us where the economy is 9 months from now. And then that will determine whether we're correct or not about, inflation remaining stickier than previously thought, rates remaining higher than previously thought. So I don't want to downplay it because I know a lot of people have a lot hanging on this, but I don't know. It's just not a huge thing I'm that focused on relative to these other more forward-looking indicators.
Yeah, and I just want to point out sort of 3 things that are bothering me about the narrative that's coming out around this print, that inflation is over and maybe the Fed can declare victory and things like that. The first is that the hiring numbers are still, I know they slowed down a little bit this month, but we're still adding jobs. The labor market is still tight. So as long as that's true, I don't know how Powell can decide that, okay, I've done my job. And we've talked about how he really has a missionary zeal to crush inflation here. So until all the indicators are pointing in that direction and until it's unambiguous, I don't feel like he's going to take his foot off the gas pedal. The second is the extent to which energy plays such a big role here. Energy prices are down 16.7% over the last 12 months. And I've been very bearish on oil to start this year. But one of the things I've been saying, I say this in the sit rep this week, is, I also talked about how there's incremental supply disruptions that you could get. So let's say you get some trouble in Libya or you get some trouble in Iraq or something doesn't go well in sort of a fringe producer like a Nigeria. Then if you get China revving up just a little bit and maybe growth numbers in China aren't doing well, but you look at power demand, you look at some other indicators in the Chinese economy, they're consuming. So you start to put all those pictures together. I'm getting increasingly more worried that maybe energy prices, especially oil prices, could go up towards the second half of the year. We just released a report this week about how we're bullish natural gas for the rest of the year. So if you start getting energy price rises over the next 6, even 9 months, suddenly that CPI is not going to look that pretty. And then the last thing is just, and this is anecdotal, but it's just the data supporting it. I mean, Delta's CEO came out and said Delta had record quarterly earnings. They're noticing that people are beginning to fly past Labor Day. So because of working from home or just because people want to get out of Dodge, I don't know, but they're seeing demand increasing September, October. I was trying to look at tickets to get to an event in Budapest in September. Tickets are ridiculously priced. So the CPI says airplane tickets are going down. I don't see that at all. So people are traveling and have money to spend. So when you put all these things together, I don't know. It doesn't feel to me like we're anywhere near the end of the inflation melodrama. So I guess I'm with you on don't focus too much on the CPI print. It's one data point. Maybe it tells us something about where we're going, but most of the forward-looking data to me does not suggest that it's coming off the boil in any meaningful way.
Well, let me just make one more point here, which I think is important. We talk about technical analysis a lot here, and you say that word to a lot of people and their eyes glaze over. But what that simply means is, what is Mr. Market telling us? What is Mr. Market telling us about the direction of the economy, about the future trajectory of the way things are going? And if you look at the markets right now, what is happening in the markets? In the bond markets, the 2-year Treasury yield, I'm bringing up Bloomberg right now, as we talk, is 4.64%. That's the 2-year Treasury yield. That's down from 4.98% last week before this CPI print. It's still the highest 2-year Treasury yield. It's a new all-time high. It's higher than it has been in the last year, which is higher than it's been for a very long time. So Mr. Market is saying, yeah, it's down a little bit from the super peak of a week ago, but we're still way off in super high territory. So that's really important. And then within the equity markets, look at what's happening within equity markets. So everyone is pointing out, oh, these big tech stocks are leading the market. That's not true. They are performing very well, but what else is really ripping in this market? It's industrial companies. It's companies like Martin Marietta Materials, which makes aggregate and concrete. What do you think about the construction cycle if Martin Marietta is making a new all-time high this week? Home builders are, as we talk, the home builder index is testing its all-time highs. Like 10-year highs. So I don't want to get into the minutia because I know a lot of our listeners don't care about markets per se, but it's important to watch these things because they give you an indicator of where things are heading in the future. And right now, you look at some of these kind of inter-segment or industry group relative performers, and this is not showing signs that we're heading into a recession. Like home builders don't make new highs when you're going into a recession. That just maybe there'll be a first, but it would be awfully weird if all of the cyclical construction and equipment companies were ripping right before the economy is lurching into another, the abyss. So for what it's worth, I think that's a pretty strong data point that you have to argue against if you think that CPI is forward-looking and that we're just rolling over into oblivion here.
Yeah, and the last point I'll make on this, because I'm glad you brought that up, is also we're still in deglobalization land. So, okay, Blinken is meeting a top Chinese official for the second time in a month. Yellen was in China. China and the United States are trying to make nice with each other. On the flip side, you've got these gallium and germanium bans, or export controls, I should say, that I already talked about. You've got China saying that they're going to restrict certain AI things. We were talking about semiconductors in our innovation meeting this week. I did some research out of that conversation. You've got Turkey coming out and saying they're trying to make 65 nanometer chips by the end of the year. India's trying to make their own chips, all of which is to say, like, decoupling is real. It's alive. That means the cost of goods is going to go up because of all that supply side inflation. And that's the geopolitical angle in all of this. So when you just put it all together, I don't know that the picture is as pretty as people are trying to make it with the CPI print. Rob, you were worried that we wouldn't have anything to say about this, but we squeezed a good 12 minutes out of that. That was good.
You got me fired up. Let's talk about the germanium and the gallium, because that's definitely an area of interest. Do you want to share your thoughts on that?
Sure. I did a little bit of an update on that last week. I think there's a much broader trend here. So if you want to hear specifically about germanium and gallium, you can go listen to the solo episode last week. We're also going to put out a report on this for Knowledge Platform subscribers probably next week. So if this is a topic that's interesting to you, write into us. I know that it's affecting lots of companies. And there's also, you're talking about minutia. There's the metals and the ores themselves, which are usually mined as byproducts. Then there's, the different things that they get made into to make wafers, and that's a whole different supply chain. So I don't really want to get into that. But one thing that struck my eye this week, which I really wasn't aware of, but It came up because the Indian Supreme Court is hearing some challenges to the Indian government decision to revoke Kashmir's special status, autonomous special status. And that's a whole nother topic as well. But as I was digging around for information about that, I learned that apparently India discovered a bunch of lithium in Kashmir around February or March. I mean, just a massive amount. And so now the Indian government this week has basically changed one of their mining laws that was on the books from 1957 to approve commercial mining of lithium, titanium, niobium, and a couple of metals. We'll have to have Tomas on to tell us how they're important or whether they're important. And the reason I thought it was important to bring that up is just to say it's not just a US-China story. Like you've got in South America, they're talking about a lithium cartel modeled on OPEC. And in India now, we're talking about, we got to mine things. Like the government is now going to support mining, whereas it's been restricting mining for a long time. I think China may see the writing on the wall that they've had this dominant position because they've been willing to mine more cheaply and not worried about the pollution of mining than anybody else. But I just think that's fundamentally changing. I think it's a bold new future for mining in general. So, I mean, this also dovetails with the inflation thing that we were just talking about. Like the inputs of things, all those supply chains are literally changing all around us. So yeah, that I think is the broader macro view to take from the gallium germanium thing, which is a very sort of specific, tit for tat thing that China did in response to the United States. All right, well, so let's go from inflation and move on to sort of the biggest geopolitical event of the week, because it may be quiet in markets right now. It is not quiet with geopolitics at all. I was actually thinking about this in the shower this morning before we got on the podcast. It's crazy how much shit is going on in the world. Like there's a full-scale war in Russia, Ukraine, and a Ukrainian counteroffensive. NATO is recruiting new allies, not just in Europe, but in Asia. Sudan is having a civil war that looks worse by the week, and unless you're really looking for details, you can't find it. We'll talk about some developments in South America later. But let's start with the biggest geopolitical news of the week, which really just is NATO. And I don't know, Rob, we could dive into Turkey's about face on Sweden. We could dive into NATO's communique about Ukraine's future membership. We could dive into NATO deals or NATO trying to get closer with Japan and South Korea. Of the menu of those NATO items, which one do you want to start with?
Why don't we start with Turkey, because that's obviously an area of great interest for us, and then we can pivot into the broader NATO issues. Why is Erdogan doing such an about face? Can you lay it out for us?
I'll try. So let's just give the brief background here. So after Russia invaded Ukraine, you had Finland and Sweden, which both were not members of NATO and sort of had neutrality in general, or ideas about neutrality. And Sweden has a long-standing tradition of neutrality going back to the early 1800s, the Napoleonic Wars, and getting their butts kicked by the Russians in general. And you had both Sweden and Finland jettison that neutrality and say, okay, we'd like to join NATO now. We're afraid of Russia. Finland got in, no problem. But Sweden was hung up on a lot of different issues related to, well, basically Turkey said, we're not going to approve Sweden. And Turkey said, well, it's because they're supporting Kurdish terrorists, or we don't like their militancy laws. Then there were these protests in Sweden where they were doing Quran burning. Erdogan was like, oh, we're going to show the West. We're going to teach the West that they can't insult our religion this way. Turkey also apparently was mad that Sweden had cut off arms exports to them. So it was just kind of this Erdogan was banging this drum that he wasn't going to let Sweden in unless they did certain things. And as recently as last week, he was saying the same thing. He was saying, hey, these Swedish protests about the Quran, this is going to make it even more problematic for Sweden to be let into NATO. And then he does the about face. Suddenly at the beginning of the week, you have the NATO summit and Erdogan's like, all right, we're good with Sweden. Oh, I'm sorry. I should have said also in the context of all this, at the end of last week, Erdogan also started talking about, well, what we really want is EU membership. So we'll let Sweden in if you let us talk about EU membership, which is bonkers. Like, this is what the Turkish opposition was talking about. They were saying, hey, if we get elected, we're going to reverse all of Erdogan's policies. We're going to try to, pursue EU accession again. And then Erdogan is like, well, if NATO lets Sweden in, like, we can trade that for EU accession. So, okay, so that's the context. Beginning of this week, suddenly, like, it's cool. Like, Erdogan's like, all right, we're going to let Sweden in. And if you look at the agreement, Sweden agreed to, they set up some kind of joint commission on economic development between the two countries. They've already approved arms exports going forward. Sweden also basically agreed to become Turkey's lobbyist for EU accession. And I talked to Emre a little bit. Maybe we can have him back on the podcast. He said accession is probably a pipe dream. It's probably more about improving the customs union or changes to the customs union and arrangements on visas, making it easier for Turks to travel in Europe and vice versa. But either way, you have Turkey singing a very different tune. You've got the United States approved F-16 sales to Turkey immediately after this. So there's some of the quid pro quo there as well. As for what Erdogan is thinking, I mean, we laid this out in our deep analysis of the Turkish elections results. We've talked about it on the podcast. We've sent it out on the Knowledge platform. I always said, look, Turkey has gone as far as it can in this particular direction, monetary policy-wise, foreign policy-wise, etc. Their net foreign reserves were turning negative. The lira was weakening. Erdogan, I thought, had to pivot. And you saw that with monetary policy. I admit I was not expecting a foreign policy shift of this magnitude, where he was basically going to turn and embrace a lot of different priorities that the West wanted. My best guess, though, is that a lot of this has to go hat in hand with those domestic economic issues, because what is better for strengthening confidence in the lira than reopening ties with the West in general? And I think that's probably where things were going, because I think Erdogan doing this with the West did more to strengthen the Turkish lira than any central bank currency intervention, than any monetary or fiscal policy tool that they had. At the same time, and the really interesting part of this is if you look at the Russian response, they're not happy. But I mean, one of Russia's news services literally had Putin's spokesperson saying, you know what, Turkey's a member of NATO. We know they have obligations. We know they had to approve the Sweden thing. So we still want to deal with them pragmatically. Like if Russia dealt with every country in the world like that, we wouldn't be talking about a Russia-Ukraine war. There is some kind of special dispensation between Erdogan and Putin on that score. You've even got Turkey saying, hey, we're going to renegotiate the grain deal with Russia. We're going to get them to agree to 3-month extensions and more extensions, and we're still going to host Putin in August and things like that. So it seems like Turkey has been able to do this, but is still keeping ties open with Russia or still keeping that pragmatic relationship. So all of which tells me, I think it's just pure politics for Erdogan. He wants to play all different sides. He held up Sweden for as much leverage as he could. And I guess he made the decision that, okay, now is the time to flip the switch. Like he got as much as he thought he could extract. He extracted it. And now it's probably back to business as usual. That's my best guess. But he's gone much further than I thought he would. And I did think he was going to have to make major policy changes after the election.
Well, I think this is interesting, and especially if you consider Turkey's history, I guess not as surprising as many people would think, right? Because, look at Turkey historically. Every decade or so, they've had huge pivots and gone a completely different direction with economic policy. So in the 1930s, they had sort of state-driven, 5-year plan, big, state-backed bank-led capitalism. After the war, they totally liberalized and went in the, U.S. neoliberal direction, populist policies. After the coup in 1960, they shifted to state-led capitalism again, substituting industrialization, blah, blah, blah. And then when that resulted in inflation in the 70s, they went to sort of a very rigid kind of restrictive regime, kind of like we're sort of seeing today in the 1980s. And then the 90s, they went totally buck nutty and inflation went crazy. And, they liberalized the capital account and the FX accounts. And then in the 2000s, Erdogan comes in and it's all about EU accession and rigidity again and, going on the straight path and the Washington consensus, and they do great. And then what happened in the last 10 years. So is it really so shocking that they would do such an about-face, not to give sort of a long history of Turkish economic policy, but they have a history of being extremely pragmatic and being responsive to when people are starting to get pissed off. So it's a very good sign, I think, because over all those eras, they've performed well on average. Growth has chugged along.
I mean, you literally sound like a Russian analyst. So the way that Russian analysts are justifying this is that, Turkey always bounces back between West and East, and this is expected. I think what's particularly surprising about this, and maybe it shouldn't be surprising, you're right. You're right about Turkish economic policy. And I was as confident as I get on forecasts that Turkish monetary policy was going to meaningfully change as soon as Erdogan was reelected. I rarely put things, well, no, I never put things at 100% probability, but in that piece that we put out, I mean, I was 95% sure that that was the direction that Turkey was going to go. The accompanying political changes, the about face on Sweden, talking about EU accession again, trying to integrate better with EU trade, making nice with Greece. Even there was a meeting between Erdogan and the new Greek prime minister on the sidelines of the NATO summit. They're talking about establishing regular meetings again, which have been delayed since 2016. So it's just the extent of the change and the sudden embrace with the West after Erdogan really seemed to be, he's talking with Putin. He's in that sort of clique. I think that was the change that was so striking. But I think my argument would be, and I think you're exactly right, it's not that surprising. Turkey always balances, and I'm not sure it's such a change. I think maybe Turkey knew that it had a significant amount of leverage, and that if it held up Sweden's desire to join NATO, it could tangibly get some things that would help Turkey. And Erdogan, I mean, it's kind of, I hate reading brilliance backwards like this, because this all could have blown up in his face. What if he'd lost the election, anything else? But he basically had a call option on whenever he wanted to extract concessions from the EU, because the moment he said, okay, we'll let Sweden in, he got everything. So he could decide the exact moment that he actually got to announce all of these different things. So I think it's that about face that was somewhat surprising. But of course, the point I'm making to you here is when you actually sort of rigorously think about what Erdogan is doing, maybe it's not that much of a change. Maybe it's more transactional for him and for Turkey in general than it is for us in the West. And this is actually something I think about a lot. John Toland, who wrote a great book about the rise and fall of the Japanese Empire in the 20th century. There's a great chapter in there, which today might be, I don't know if people would still respect it. It's a little, it essentializes the Japanese psyche a little bit. I think it would be in danger of being called like not politically correct today. But he talks about how one of the problems in negotiations between Japan and the United States in the 1930s and 1940s were that U.S. negotiators are not comfortable with things being gray. It was black or white. You're with us or you're against us. Jedis and Sith, kind of the whole, that mode of thinking. Whereas Japan was very comfortable with contradiction. They were very comfortable with saying, well, this is true today, but this is true after dinner. And tomorrow I'm thinking this, and all of it is part of a tapestry of reality that we kind of move back and forth with. I think Turkey is probably the same way. So I think part of the problem with understanding Turkey is that people keep trying to map on that Western black and white, good and evil, with us or against us thing. And Turkey has just always rejected that. Turkey's about, well, what's good for Turkey? How do we maximize Turkish concessions? If that means today we say nice things about Sweden and we get F-16s, great. Today we say that. Tomorrow, if we need something else, okay, we hang out with Putin. We say nice things about him. We get whatever we want from Russia too. I think that's the way to think about it.
Well, pragmatically, Erdogan seems to be talking like a guy who realizes he's dependent on foreign capital flows to keep that current account deficit going. So he's saying all the right things, that's for sure.
He is. And when he's not busy hanging out with Sweden and NATO and doing all these other things and calling Putin on the phone, the real important thing that he's doing is touring the Gulf and getting promises of Saudi investment and, Emirati investment and everything else. So you can see the picture coming together. He's normalized monetary policy. He's improved ties with the West. He's getting cash from the Gulf states. He's got cheap commodities coming in from Russia. Like it's a pretty well played a pretty well played strategy so far. The other, I mean, I think we should also just spend a couple minutes on the NATO communique. And I'll quote from it here. The communique is very long. It has over 70 points. I didn't get through all of them, but I wanted to see what points they made about Ukraine. And there's basically two. The first is sort of, it says point blank, Ukraine's future is in NATO. Full stop. And then, but it also says, look, we have all these reforms and things that Ukraine has to do before we can welcome Ukraine into the alliance. So Ukraine's future is in NATO, and it will become a member of NATO once it satisfies all these different criteria and all of the NATO member states believe that Ukraine has signed off on these criteria. And as we just saw with Turkey and Sweden, that's not a foregone conclusion. And you can bet that Ukraine's inclusion in NATO is going to be a lot more controversial than bringing Sweden into the party. And I'm struggling a little bit with does NATO really mean that? Do they really want Ukraine in the alliance? Do they feel like they have to say that in the context of the war right now to buttress Ukraine's chances? I don't buy any of Putin's propaganda about NATO, but he's also said, hey, Ukraine and NATO is the national security threat that is animating all of our moves in Ukraine right now. You've basically just come out and said, okay, like, you're right. We want them in NATO. Their places in NATO. So in some ways, you're justifying that. And, you know, if you let Ukraine into NATO, suddenly NATO has to defend Ukraine. And unlike most of the countries in NATO, like, Ukraine faces a real threat. The flip side is, you didn't have to do that. You didn't have to include them. You can continue doing what you're doing, supporting them in the war, supplying weapons with them, et cetera, without actually having to welcome them in. So I'm struggling with what exactly NATO's intentions are, what it thinks going forward. Because at least on paper, it's saying one thing, but then it's also setting almost completely unrealistic benchmarks for Ukraine's eventual entry. And maybe that's the ambiguity they want, but it was a little bit of a head scratcher for me.
Well, I have two questions for you. The first is the fact that Ukraine is in an active war. How does that affect things? Is this sort of hypothetical? If the war is resolved, then they would get in? That's sort of a pragmatic question. And sort of the bigger question is, you've given the presentation on Russia's incentives multiple times and rooting it in geography and the need to express power all the way to the Carpathian Mountains. What happens if Ukraine enters NATO and all of a sudden, the Western enemy is inside the gates, sort of quasi-permanently? Even if you get a regime change in the future in Russia, things look very different. Won't that sort of create a permanent incentive for them to behave differently in the future? You understand what I'm asking?
I think I understand what you're asking, but I mean, we're really just talking about a prolonged period of Russian weakness. So instead of, I actually wrote an article back in my GPF days, I think it was 2017, maybe it was 2018, called the second partition of Ukraine. I was obviously calling out the partitions of Poland in the 19th century. I love how I said that. I'm obviously calling out the partitions of Poland in the 19th century, which obviously you all spend your waking hours thinking about. But maybe it was the reverse. Like, maybe it's the partition of Russia we should be talking about, and the slow deterioration of the Russian Federation, because maybe China takes parts in the East back, and maybe Ukraine goes independent. And if Ukraine goes independent and joins the EU, maybe Lukashenko and Belarus change their minds about where they want to be. Now we start looking to the South Caucasus and, Azerbaijan and everything that's going on there. So inside the gates, there's no threat. It's not like NATO wants to march towards Moscow. So it's not going to be that sort of level of threat. But, if Ukraine gets integrated into the Western alliance structure, I mean, Putin's assertion that he's helped make Russia secure is that much more hollow, right? Because nothing that he's done has actually come true. And in some ways, he's worsened Russian national security over and over again. It also might force a future Russian government just to make terms with the fact that, okay, like, we are fundamentally weak. We can't even guarantee our security in these areas. So maybe you would see a regime in Moscow understand, okay, maybe we have to deal with the Europeans. Maybe we have to deal with the West. We can't sort of stand on our own. That's very difficult to imagine today. It would require, as you say, a regime change of sorts. But that I think is what is at stake, which is why Russia will probably fight tooth and nail. And I think they're betting that they will outlast Ukraine and outlast the West's ability and desire to support Ukraine. And so for our last big picture topic, before we maybe sprinkle in some other stuff happening around the world, although we might just spend the rest of the time on this, Rob, your favorite hobby horse, and I'm beginning to become converted, which is Brazil. There's a smaller story and a bigger story. The smaller story is just that Brazil's lower house, by a pretty wide margin, passed a major tax reform initiative. And this is something that you brought up. You've been on this since the very beginning. It's what Brazilian voters want. It still has to go through the Brazilian Senate, still has to then maybe go back to, there's still some steps here that have to happen before we have tax reform. So we can't say, aha, like, tax reform has happened and we told you so. But it was a major step forward. And it's also coupled this week with reports that Lula is reaching out to some of the centrist parties and even more center-right parties to bring them into his cabinet. Maybe he's going to reshuffle the cabinet and bring in some more centrist ministers and things like that. All of which is just to say, we said once Lula got elected, he's not going to be able to govern the way that he wants to. The legislature is against him. He's going to have to moderate himself. And B, this tax reform issue is the big deal. And we are seeing Brazil moderate. So instead of going off the rails like Colombia or Peru, Lula's wise enough to negotiate and try and build coalitions and consensus. So that's a positive sign. And you have this major tax reform initiative that is sitting there and could really change things for Brazil. So I wanted to give you the chance to at least riff on that for a moment.
Yeah, I mean, the big thing that I would point out is just this is the biggest piece of economic news that no one is talking about. And just to put it into context, I mean, tax reform in Brazil or the tax structure in Brazil has been a notorious bugbear for years and years and years. They often refer to it as the custo Brasil, the cost of doing things in Brazil because of the tax structure is so onerous and wacky, and it takes hundreds of hours just to file your taxes and dealing with all the value-added tax and the import tax. And I mean, it's a nightmare. So the fact that they were able to pass this reform to make meaningful improvements here is a huge data point in support of this notion that, Brazil is normalizing. It's moving away. If you think of it like in the world that we imagine, the multipolar worlds, some countries are going to be like, turning and turning in the widening gyre, to use some Yeats metaphor here, and others are going to be moving in the opposite direction from that, responding to the chaos around them by sort of finding a common ground and actually having an impetus to make positive reforms. Brazil is definitely in the latter camp, and this is a sign of that happening. It was only a few months ago that people thought that Brazil was going off the rails, that there was, a Bolsonaro revolution in the works and dysfunction, and it's been shown that that's just not happening. So very positive stuff.
Yeah, it's weird. I think I've said this once or twice, but I'll repeat it again. It's the take that I've gotten the most heat on from social media, and social media is not a real place, but whatever. Like, I got anytime I talk about Brazil and the potential of Brazil, all these people come out and say, no, Brazil sucks. You have no idea what you're talking about. How could you pretend to be in macro and geopolitics if you think Brazil is going to do well? I don't quite understand the vitriol from that sector, but in general, I mean, Brazil is just looking really, really good. There's a quote about Brazil that is attributed to de Gaulle. It looks like de Gaulle didn't actually say it, but it sounds better to say it was attributed to some famous person. But the quote is supposed to be from the 1960s, and it's that Brazil is the country of the future and always will be. I think the future looks like it's now. I mean, we could, maybe Lula goes crazy. Maybe Brazil's Congress fumbles the ball and they don't pass the reform in the end. But I don't know. All the data points to what you're saying right now are looking good for Brazil in general. But there was another more idiosyncratic story that also caught my eye this week in Brazil, which was that the mayor of Rio de Janeiro basically approved this measure that says that schools in Brazil, that they're basically banning food that is overly processed or not good for you. So they're banning things like diet sodas, hot dogs, refined sugars, chocolate candy, things like that. Schools in Rio have 180 days to comply with the measure. And if they are found after 180 days to not be in compliance, they will begin getting daily fines of 1,500 reais a day until they come into compliance with the measure. I wasn't expecting you to be as excited as you were about this. I'll tell you that my take was, and I've been thinking about this a lot from an agricultural perspective, because it just feels, and maybe every generation feels this way, but it seems to me like millennials and afterwards are very health conscious and care more about where their food comes from. And there's this emphasis, it starts in the 80s and 90s, and we can talk about, farm to table and where that comes from. But I think there is this consciousness of we want better food, we want better quality food, we'll pay more for it. The culture of, taking pictures of your really good food and where it comes from, like that, like millennials and post-millennials and Gen Z, I think we care more about that. And that's why when I go speaking to groups that are in lentils or dry peas or sunflower oil and things like that, I'm usually more optimistic with them. And I usually tell them, don't think so much about exports. Like, you have a whole class of Americans who are more health conscious, who want alternative sources of protein, who want things. If you can make that health case to them, things are going to be different. But I was really thinking about it from a US perspective. Here's an example of Brazil thinking about it from that perspective as well. And maybe there's just a global phenomenon in developed countries where people want healthier food. I don't know. Maybe that's also crazy. I have the words ringing in my ear of a colleague of yours who says never to short fat people. But I don't know. It felt notable to me that was something that a mayor of Rio was pushing through for Brazilian schools, and that maybe there was a broader trend there. Tell me if I'm crazy.
I think the first thing to note about this story is that when you picture a hot dog in Brazil, it's not what we think of, like a little hot dog on one of those, French style buns. The hot dogs down there are freaking enormous. They're like loaves of bread stuffed with meat and cheese, and these things are huge and they're fried. And anyway, so just to set the picture there, that's what a hot dog is like in the south of Brazil.
Yeah, although, I mean, they're not so great here. I realize that they can make them look... Have you ever seen the video of Snoop Dogg, like, watching hot dogs being made, like, the process of making them, and, like, it comes out at the end as a hot dog, and he's like, that's disgusting. I'm never eating a hot dog again. I mean, like, hot dogs are... And don't get me wrong, love a Hebrew National with some spicy brown mustard, but they are gross if you actually, like, think about what goes into them. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, they're kind of weird. That's for sure. But, so just to riff on what you're saying, I think the health conscious trend. So, like, it's funny when you're dealing in stocks for a living, you see these quote unquote trends that companies like to highlight because they're always trying to talk up their own business and the secular growth opportunities. But sort of growing health awareness is one of the biggest things that companies all point to. That people are becoming more informed, people are becoming more conscious about where their food is coming from, what's going into it, ingredient quality, reading ingredients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's definitely happening, and it's a trend that you should be aware of if you're dealing in markets for the long term, because this is shaping how people are behaving and what they're buying. Another thing I would just point out is, I think the just don't short fat people, I suspect that is a dictum that is outdated now. I think that describes a former era. And here's why. I'm going to tie this into AI because, one of the things, like we've talked about this, we did a whole podcast about how Americans are basically getting fat and drug-addled and dying. So the listeners will be familiar with our take on that. And that's sort of the popular view, like, everyone's going to get diabetes. Diabetes rates are rising through the roof. It's going to be 30-40% of the population. Like, basically, we were talking yesterday about demographics and how it's impossible to predict. And people often take the demographic picture of today and they just project it out into the future. And I think people are doing that with this issue as well. And here's a theory that I just want to throw out there. What if that whole trend has bottomed? And the reason why I say I connect it to AI is because so much of eating is because of lack of behavioral reinforcers. So we're surrounded. I mean, you're in New Orleans. My God, I can't imagine how you're not just completely obese, Jacob. Like,
my aunt literally said that to me last week. She's like, I have no idea how you're succeeding. She lives in San Francisco.
Well, you sent me that picture of the po' boys at that place down the street from you. I mean, if that were down the street from me, I'd be in big trouble. I'll just say that.
I didn't just send you a picture of the po' boys. I sent you a picture of Janet Yellen eating the po' boy, which I hope she canceled her afternoon. When I go to Dom Elisa's and I have a po' boy, I'm not doing anything else the rest of the afternoon. She ostensibly was here on the taxpayer's dollar to do shit. But anyway, sorry, keep interrupting. Go
on. But it's about behavioral reinforcement. And right now, the default is there's fatty food everywhere. Companies have a huge incentive to sell it to us because we want it, we crave it. And we don't have behavioral mechanisms in place. We don't have reminders. We don't have nudges. We don't have controls to say, hey, don't eat that po' boy. That's a really bad idea. And what I would say is I suspect this is going to be much more of a topic of discussion in the next few years, but the ability of AI to play that role is going to be huge because it can monitor what you're doing. It can be, tied into your health trackers, and to have what is effectively an intelligence that's with you, watching over you and trying to get you to do the right thing. I think it's a change that's much bigger in importance and magnitude than people probably realize today. Because if you look at where we've been so far, we have compute. Compute is everywhere. You can wear, a Fitbit. You can track your health stats with your Apple Watch. You can, follow the quantified self movement, all of this stuff. The problem is it's exhausting to try to make sense of that data. There was a really good interview with, Kevin Kelly, the guy who founded Wired magazine, really super interesting person. And he was one of the pioneers of the quantified self movement. And he, in the interview, said, I haven't done quantified self stuff for years because I just found it so hard to make sense of the data and to get actual insights from it. It was just a flow of data that was exhausting rather than empowering. And I think that missing element is to have an AI agent to interpret that and say, what needs to be said to analyze and to give behavioral reinforcement in a way that's positive. So maybe that's kind of a kooky thing to say, but I that's my suspicion, is that the secular decline in, or the secular rise, I should say, in American fat people might have peaked.
Well, yeah, although, again, we're talking about Brazil here too. And this is the other thing, like we've talked about the United States here, but only 45% of our listeners are in the United States. The rest are spread around the world. And I often put up a chart when I'm especially talking to agriculture audiences of obesity rates are increasing everywhere. Even in parts of the undeveloped world, it's the quality of food is so bad. So even parts of North Africa that struggle to even have enough calories to feed the population, their obesity rates are going up as well. So it's not just sort of the United States. But I also, like, my own health journey is like now tied to the podcast as well, because you probably remember we had Jordi Visser on, I don't know, months ago now. I owe him a call back to get him back on. And one of the things that he talked about was the wearables industry and how excited he was about it. And he showed off his Oura Ring. And I was interested enough that I went and got an Oura Ring. And I've become like minorly obsessed with it. And it's not an AI necessarily. It's not, telling me what to eat or when to eat and things like that. But just having something that says, okay, here are the data points that are important. Here are some tips about how to improve your data points, and having that check in every day, it's completely changed my diet, my routine, like how I exercise, how I think about when I go to sleep and when I wake up and things like that. And you're right. Sometimes it's overwhelming. Like sometimes I feel like I'm not balancing well enough between, you still have to be able to go have a glass of wine or go on an ice cream date or something like that and enjoy yourself. You can have one day of bad data and like enjoy your life. There's a whole mental health thing to this as well. But it really has changed the way I think about things. And I don't know if it's just, it's sort of like, you ever have that phenomenon where you see a word that you don't know and you look it up in the dictionary, and then suddenly everywhere you go, you see that word. I sort of feel that way now about this. I feel like I didn't notice anybody with Oura Rings or anybody talking about their Fitbits. And now it's like everybody's talking about it, everybody I encounter. So maybe I'm just part of the herd here. But just personally, that sort of tracks. I think what was surprising to me was, I think about that in the United States. I think about that in some of these other circles. To have a city in Brazil say that, okay, from now on, like children are going to eat good, like, and we're gonna really enforce this. I don't know, and that's in a country that has a lot of, just look at the pictures of the corn crop in Brazil this year or the soybean crop in Brazil this year. They have a lot of cheap food, a lot of cheap calories that they have to move. So it was all the more interesting to me that a city like Rio was putting through that kind of health conscious thing. Yeah.
And in the Brazil context, especially, like, one of the things that Brazilians often, lament about their own country is they say, oh, people are uneducated, and that's why they behave badly. So people drink too much, they drink cachaça, they get in accidents, they eat badly, they get fat. I think I told you this, but one time when I was in Brazil, I was driving on the highway and there was a motorcycle in front of me going like 80 or 90 miles an hour. and there was a guy on the motorcycle and a girl behind him, no helmets, and the girl was carrying a full-size surfboard on the motorcycle, like a 10-foot surfboard. And like, if you just turn the wrong way, they'd both get kind of blown off this thing. Anyway, that was like my personal experience of, oh yeah, like risk tolerance is quite high here. But my point being that like, that's often the dig that Brazilians make about themselves, is they don't take care of themselves. And I find it interesting that this should happen in a place like Rio. It really shows that this trend is a very powerful one and a very broad one. And people want to be healthy. I think that's the most important thing, is like, when you look at sort of these behavioral issues and all sorts of healthcare. So like, even if you look at diabetes, which is a lifestyle disease, type 2 diabetes, the biggest thing is just getting people to comply with the treatment, to comply with the lifestyle factors that you need to do. And if you're using like a glucose monitor, to actually use it is a burden. It's a lot of work. You need to interpret the information. You need to remember to do it. It's to take care of yourself is a burden. And I guess what I'm trying to say is, if people want to be healthy, if they don't want to be overweight, they don't want to be obese and have health issues, if they have that desire, then the ability to have some sort of compute-driven intelligence to help you with that journey is going to take a lot of that mental burden off of the individual person to manage their own behavior. And that's a huge, subtle, but very huge change.
Mm-hmm. We'll close out. I mean, we've already been going 50 minutes, so I don't want to take too much time of the listener, for the listeners. But there's a couple smattering of things. Maybe we can both just close off with one thing that's caught our attention. For me, it's the situation in Peru seems to be bubbling up again, and it reminds me that I need to reach out to our good friend Elohim to get some context about what's going on in Brazil. But Brazil extended a state of emergency in the copper-producing regions of the country in the south. Listeners might remember earlier this year, we were very concerned that because of anti-government protest and disruptions with copper supply chains, that Peru, which is the number 2 copper exporter in the world, copper just wasn't getting out, and was that going to affect copper prices and things like that? That didn't end up working. That trade didn't end up working, and Peru managed to get things going again before the situation got particularly dire. But you've got that announcement in the south, and then you've got reports that Peruvian protesters are getting ready to descend on Lima, and that the Peruvian police are gearing up for an influx of protesters in the city. The new president is well liked by the business community, it looks like, according to polls, but basically the rest of the population still hates her. So for me, Peru has been a little bit of a mystery this year. You had those intense anti-government protests. Elohim was on the podcast around the times, talking about a potential civil war, or at least, violence between protesters and the military forces in Peru, and maybe a coup to take out Boluarte. Then it all kind of went away. She seemed to be able to put things back in the box. But just little tiny nascent signals that maybe something else is happening in Peru again. So one of the things I would put on your radar, even as, the Wall Street Journal focuses on CPI. Is there something else on your radar, Rob, that you want to give the listeners something to think about, or shall we say goodbye?
No, nothing new. I guess the only thing I would add on the Peru thing is, when I think about how do you model out some of the behavior of these countries, both from a macro standpoint and from just a political standpoint, I use that phrase turning and churning and the widening gyre before, but that's what that describes as a volatility spiral. And I think that's a term that one should be thinking about and familiarizing themselves with, because in situations like this, where you have like volatility spirals apply to markets, where volatility starts to pick up, things start kicking very violently in either direction, and that tends to feed on itself. So volatility begets more volatility, and the opposite. Things calm down, that makes things calm down even more. And I think the same applies at the country level too. And you look at some of these places like Peru, where things start going off the rails a little bit, and that causes a reaction, and then, a stronger reaction in the opposite direction. I just wonder if that's a way to think about sort of the potential trajectory of some of these countries that are, unlike Brazil, which I would say is in that tightening volatility, things are normalizing more and more, getting better, are in the opposite situation.
What is the opposite of a volatility spiral? A stability vortex? A stability whirlpool? I don't know.
A volatility compression? That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, some homework for us to think about. Listeners, don't eat any hot dogs. We'll see you later. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.